Hey everybody, today I want to talk to you about my two favorite hormones, insulin and glucagon. So big players in the world of fat burning, depending on who you talk to. Insulin I put in red because I like to think of it as the stop hormone. So insulin stops or slows down fat burning, and glucagon I put in green because it's the go hormone. It allows you to burn energy, burn fat. So most people think that insulin is like an on-off switch. You eat anything that spikes your insulin, fat burning, shut off. Oh no, I'm only gaining weight, I can't lose it. You know, the goal is to keep insulin as low as possible. We can't avoid spiking insulin. We always have some insulin in our system at all time, a basal amount. If you don't, you're type 1 diabetic. It's not a good situation. So you can't avoid spiking insulin. Every time you eat anything, even fat, has a little insulin effect. So let's take a little look first at the way insulin actually works. So do a little graph here. This side of the graph, you got insulin level, and on this axis, you have time. So let's say you eat a high carb meal. You go from your basal amount, spikes really high, stays high for a bit, and then starts coming back down to baseline. So this is 0 minutes. This is your eating time. This takes about 30 minutes on average to reach your peak. And then you're at your peak for usually about another 30 minutes. 60 minutes. And then insulin starts to drop back down again. And then you're back to baseline, usually for the average person is about 2 hours. So all this time, from here until here, you're not blocked of burning fat. You can still burn fat this whole time. So when most people say insulin is like an on-off switch, as soon as you spike it, you're done fat burning, it's not true. It's more like a dimmer switch. So you know these things, you know, on, off. If your switch is up here, your lights are on. If your switch is down here, your lights are off. But what about all this range in here? It's the same situation. So on the way up, you're moving that switch down to off. On the way down, you're moving the switch back on up to on. So let's actually change this around. Not make this on off. Make it insulin. And down here, glucagon. So let's think of it as a dimmer switch instead of an on-off switch. So here's what happens when you eat something with high carbs. You flick that switch, you start moving it up. So I'm going to move it up. It's going up, 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 up. Once you get to here, the switch is all the way up. Yes, your fat burning's off. But all the way up from here to here, you still have some fat burning. So fat might be going into cells, but it's also still coming out until you reach that very top. And then yes, it's off. Then you're only at that off position for 30 minutes. Maybe a little more depending on how insulin resistant you are. But the average person, you get 30 minutes where you're not burning any fat out of that meal or out of the window of your eating window. And then it starts going back down. Your dimmer switch starts moving all the way back down. And this whole curve, you're starting to burn fat again. Primarily not, and then more and more and more until you reach your basal limit again, and then you're burning fat 100%. So it's not like, oh no, I've eaten a meal, I have 2 hours where I'm not burning any fat. You have 30 minutes where you're burning no fat, and you have an hour and a half where you are still burning some percentage of fat. Yes, it's less, but it's not completely shut off. Okay, let's look at a few different approaches. We'll look at a SAD diet, high in carb. We'll look at maybe a paleo type approach, lower in carb, but still allows you to have all those sweet potatoes and some natural fruits, what have you. And then we'll look at a ketogenic approach, very low carb, moderate protein, very high fat. Draw another graph here. Still have insulin on this axis, time on this axis. Put our high carb meal in red, of course. So we start off at our baseline amount, always a baseline of insulin. Spikes up really high, really quick, then tapers off back to baseline. Now the same thing's going to happen for the paleo meal, but because it's lower in carb, higher in fat most likely, higher in protein usually, you're still going to have your baseline amount. Still going to spike up, not as high though. Return to baseline. Now, when you take your ketogenic meal, because it's so high in fat, so very low in carb, hopefully moderately enough in protein, again, you still start at your baseline. It's going to spike up, but it's not going to spike up as high and quickly return to baseline and stay there. So you can see the difference in how these might react. Thinking about what we just spoke about how insulin actually works, doesn't completely shut you off all the time. Let's take a closer look. So we knew this peak here is about 30 minutes. Let's say here's about 60, and here's 2 hours. So look at the high carb meal. Insulin spikes way up, so you're shut off. You're shut off for 20-30 minutes completely, and it starts dropping, glucagon comes out, starts pushing energy out of cells again. And then on the downswing, you progressively burn more and more fat until you get back to baseline where you're burning exclusively fat pretty well. So now look at the paleo. Big improvement, huge improvement paleo from a SAD diet. Because there's less carbs, and more fat, more protein, you get less of a spike. Still goes up. Insulin still takes over some. Glucagon gets pushed out of the way a little bit. You burn less fat, but you're not shut off. You're still burning some fat here. So instead of being all the way at the top and being off, you're about halfway in between. So you still got this range of fat that you're using, even at the peak. So you're not off, you're not done. So you have 30 minutes of less fat burning, but then within 30 minutes you're on the downswing again, and it moves down until you're burning fat again. So better scenario. Now the ketogenic approach, you can see there's barely any spike at all. So instead of at your peak being all the way up here, or even with the paleo approach being there, you've only hit here. So you've got all this range of fat burning that with this approach, with the carb approach, you're only getting out here almost at 2 hours. So the whole range, through the whole range of that meal, you're still burning fat. You're still burning a lot of fat. But within 60 minutes, you're back to baseline. So instead of from 60 minutes to 2 hours and progressively burning more and more fat with the high carb or the paleo approaches, you're there after 60 minutes. That's the advantage of keto versus other ways of eating. It's not that you don't spike insulin at all, because you always do. It's that you spike it less for a shorter duration. So you have longer time burning fat than you do having to rely on carbohydrate or protein for your energy needs. Okay, so we talked about how different meals affect insulin. Your high carb SAD meal versus your paleo-ish type meal versus your keto meal. Now, just let's look at the individual macronutrients. So I put a graph here that you can take a look at. It shows carbs versus protein versus fat. You can see carbs have a massive effect. It shuts you off for a good amount of time, shuts your fat burning off, insulin's at its highest, and then it drops fairly quickly and gets you back to baseline in about 2.5 hours. And protein is about halfway in between baseline and carbs, but even fat has some effect. It's slower because fat takes longer to actually absorb it into the system than carbs or protein. But it's barely raised enough to make any difference at all. It hits a short peak and then it's right back to baseline within no time. It doesn't really have much of an effect at all, just enough to get the fat moving through the body into the cells, but it's still moving out faster than it's moving in. So if you eat just pure fat, it doesn't really cause you to stop burning fat at all. It barely slows it down. Yes, you do have some insulin effect, but it's not something you need to worry about. Now, should you be eating fat non-stop all day long? Probably not, because that does slow down. I mean, you're putting fat in and you're slowing it out somewhat. So keep to your meals, eat your 3 meals. As long as you're ketogenic, you're gonna minimize that spike. So you're not gonna have a big spike. You're gonna be burning fat a lot longer than you would otherwise. Just before we finish up the video, I'm gonna put a link down below to another video talking about insulin and glucagon. I watched it a long time ago and it really opened my eyes as to how powerful glucagon is. Most people don't even think about it. All they talk about is insulin this, you know, it's the king. It does control glucagon, so it is powerful, but just the effects of glucagon alone are really, really interesting. It talks about some studies done with mice where they blocked out, they got rid of their insulin receptors, so there's essentially a type 1 diabetic mouse, and they free fed the mouse. They tried to, you know, feed them appropriately, but they would just keep wasting away to nothing with no insulin to control the glucagon. The glucagon just pushes energy out of cells regardless, so no matter how much they fed these mice, they would waste away. They'd lose weight until they wasted away to nothing and died, unfortunately. Now, they found that if they blocked out the receptors for glucagon in the mice, or even just lowered glucagon's effect, the mice were fine. They didn't waste away to nothing. They didn't even require insulin. Now, this is not saying that people don't need insulin, because people are not mice, we know this, but it's just fascinating to show that the mice were able to survive and live and stayed at a normal weight. I think some of them even might have gained weight just by blocking the effects of glucagon, and the fact that they lost weight incredibly fast and unfortunately died just by the effects of glucagon without insulin to control it. So it just kind of goes to show you that there's more at play here than what anybody thinks. It's not just all about insulin. Glucagon plays a huge role in this as well. So we kind of have to be thinking, how can we best optimize how we're pushing energy out of our cells? You know, a higher fat diet, clearly it seems to affect the peak of the insulin and the amount of time you're under insulin's effect. So personally, I don't see there being any better way to manage your weight other than keeping insulin low and glucagon high. So that's it for today. If you got any questions, comments, recommendations for future videos, you can post in the notes down below or make a comment below. Make sure to subscribe as well. It helps me out a lot. For more information, you can always go to our Facebook group. It's facebook.com/groups/commonsenseketogenics. We also have a blog at www.commonsenseketogenics.com. I'll put the links to those down in the notes as well.